Okay, everyone. My name is Michael Wayne Harris, and this is the Basics of Accessible Configuration and Development in Drupal. I'm up at ITS. And in this talk, we're going to talk about some of the more technical aspects of Drupal configuration and accessibility. The first question you might have is my site accessible? If you do have that question, please email caitlin.thompson@yale.edu. She gets a lot of those questions, and this session will not answer that question. But if you do have that question, email Caitlin. Yeah, I've already warned her that this is going to happen, so she's expecting a ton of emails in her inbox. She may not be happy with me after the fact, but that's okay. All right, so for the outline, I'm going to talk about why you should go to someone else's session instead of this one. I'm going to talk to you about what is accessibility, and then we're going to talk about actually preparing and doing some of this stuff. But the first section is why you should not be here. So basically, this session really isn't for you. You should only be here if you know HTML very well. You should be a YaleSites or a Drupal super user. You should be comfortable inspecting the DOM. If you don't know what inspecting the DOM is, this really isn't for you. And you should have a strong hatred of the markup that Drupal outputs by default. For example, if you can read this, if this looks familiar to you and you hate it, you can be here. If you don't know what this is, you should probably leave. Really, this is not the session for you because I talk fast, I go through my slides fast, I have like 40 of them to go through in 50 minutes, and you're not going to be able to take notes, and I don't stop for questions. You're really not going to hurt my feelings if you leave. The other sessions that are happening right now are image annotations using Mirador, which is where I wish I could be, and building YaleSites for the user by my colleague April, who's really, really great. Okay, some people are going to stay on. I was really hoping that we could just, be done early and, we could all go ahead to the bar. Good luck, you guys, if you are heading out. For those of you who are brave enough to stay, what is accessibility? Accessibility is usability for people with disabilities. Disabilities include blindness, color blindness, low vision, deafness, motor disabilities, and cognitive disabilities. This is basically for people who can't see the computer screen, who can't see the computer screen well, who have low vision and therefore need the whole screen magnified for them. People who are deaf, people with motor disabilities, which might prevent them from using a mouse, for example, or people with cognitive disabilities that includes learning disabilities, epilepsy, ADHD, sort of anything of that sort. And so what you can think of accessibility as making websites and applications easy to use for people who identify as having sort of any of these disabilities. Another way to think about accessibility is adherence to a technical standard. There have been sort of laws and standards written around accessibility, and being familiar with what those standards are is also helpful. There's Section 508, which is sort of a federal law that many of you might be familiar with. There's WCAG 2.0, which is those of you who don't know a lot about the federal law but have been sort of following accessibility efforts at Yale. This might make a little bit more sense for you. There's also ATAG 2.0 Part B, which is actually what we're doing here, even though no one really knows it. We can pretend we're doing WCAG 2.0. I'm the only person on campus who knows what ATAG is. I just like to show off. We can also think of accessibility as a civic responsibility. If you ask the United Nations, access and to information technology in a format that is usable is a human right. And so, this is serious stuff. It's civil rights. If you imagine with people who have disabilities, you can imagine a case where you go online to register to vote. If you have a disability, say you're blind, and if the website isn't coded in such a way that someone who is blind can use the website, then that person can't register for vote online. It becomes a lot harder for them to just participate in government and civic life. So civil rights. This is not having accessible websites is the same as sort of having accessible buildings. You need elevators and you need escalators and you need sort of ramps for things. You also need accessible websites. It's the same idea, even though it's a different medium. Participation of the government. examples like going to vote, getting information about various legislation, getting information about what's happening in your community. If those websites aren't accessible, then people with disabilities, can't use those things. Participation in business and commerce. If Amazon isn't accessible, then people with disabilities can't buy things. If we think about the amount of convenience is given to us, if we don't have if we don't have a disability, we can easily use things like Amazon, eBay, what have you. If you have a disability and you can't buy things online, that cuts out a lot of commercial life that you're able to participate in. Participate in the workforce. People with disabilities tend to have a higher rate of unemployment than the general population, and a lot of that unemployment is for no good reason. They have the skills and the cognitive abilities to have the same jobs as we have. The problem is that their workplaces and the websites that they use aren't actually usable for them. So it's not anything that has to do with them that are preventing them from sort of having a job. It's the problem with our buildings and our websites and our things like that not being accessible that in many cases prevent people from sort of having jobs. And it's participation in education. You don't see a lot of blind people or people with disabilities at Yale or in any sort of institution of higher education, just because there are challenges in terms of delivering educational materials to people with disabilities in a format that they can consume. They're perfectly capable of doing the work if it's presented to them in a way that they can, but if it's not presented to them in a way that they can, they have to bug their professor. It's like, can you give me I'm blind, I can't read this PDF out of a book you scanned, several years ago, can you give it to me in a better format? And the professor's like, sure, but they don't get around to it. And then it's midterms, and you're just getting your stuff for the first time. You can't catch up in the course. Those are just some of the challenges that people face. We think about accessibility, especially in this area, as I like the idea of thinking about accessibility as usability in terms of how difficult it is to complete a task. If you and I can register for classes in 15 minutes, but it takes someone with a disability 2 hours to register for a class, and they have to have one of their friends helping them, that's a serious barrier to actually just participating in sort of educational life. If it takes me 1 minute to log in to CAS, but it takes someone with a disability like 3 minutes to log in CAS, that's not a big deal. But if it takes me minutes to do something and it takes someone else hours to do something, and they have to have another person there to help, that's when you really start to see some of the problems. But that's sort of my quick and dirty version of what accessibility is. Participation in social media as well. Historically, things like Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram haven't been great. Facebook and Twitter are getting better, but there's still a long way to go, and we all like sharing memes. So we need to participate in. So we need to make sure that those things are accessible as well. When we get ready to build a website, accessibility needs to happen sort of as early in your website planning process as possible. You could think of accessibility as a subset of usability, and you should have usability as early in your process as possible. And so likewise, you should be thinking about accessibility. I'm not going to talk about the entire accessibility lifecycle. I'm just going to talk about some of the very basics of coding. The foundation of development is understanding sort of the most important principles when it comes to actually typing the code, and then it comes to actually having a plan. When it comes to understanding accessible principles, the most important thing you can keep in mind is to use semantic markup. If you're not using semantic markup, your site isn't accessible, game over. Anything, we think about CSS accessibility, we think about JavaScript accessibility, we think about design accessibility. If you don't have the semantics in place, then you can't think about any of that other stuff. If your semantics, if your markup is not semantic, if you have divs for everything, then it's just game over. This is the most important point. That's why I'm leaving this slide up here for a really long time, because this is most of my work when I think about accessibility and I think about accessible development focuses on the semantics. So what are semantics? Understanding that you really shouldn't use div and span as a last, and except as a last result, as a last resort rather. Understanding that you should use true headings, h1, h2, h3, h4, h5, h6, instead of strong tags. Because a lot of people, if they want a visual heading, they'll just use a strong tag, and that's wrong. Or a lot of people might use a heading 6 instead of a heading 2, when a heading 2 might be more appropriate because they don't like how a heading 2 looks. They, like how a heading 6 looks. You have to understand, and you have to sort of be persuaded to the mindset that proper semantics are more important than proper visual presentation, and you can always change the visual presentation later through CSS. But you really want to use true headings, and you want to use headings in the correct order. Understanding the semantics that are built into HTML and HTML5, that includes the new HTML5 tags, header, footer, nav, aside, figure. There are more, but this is just sort of a representative example. These are your friends. These have header, footer, nav, aside, figure, have accessibility built into them. And if you're not using these tags, then you're sort of missing out on some of the accessibility benefits that are sort of built in. Knowing the difference between A and button, most people, if they want to make something clickable on their website, they'll either use an A tag or they'll use a div tag, and they'll write some fancy JavaScript, and that's bad. You should just use a button. If you're a developer and you think you want to use an A tag, but it's not actually a link to another page, or if it's not a link to sort of an anchor down the page, you should probably just use a button. This is probably, and these are things that you need to understand even before you get started, with this stuff. You need to understand the proper use of label. Labels are specifically for form controls and form controls only. I mean, you don't use labels to label things, you use labels to label form controls. If you don't know what that means, again, there are 2 other really good sessions, happening. Every image tag must have an alt attribute, but sometimes that alt attribute must be null, and sort of knowing when it must be null and when it should have a value, and even just remembering to include it at all. These are all sort of things you should understand even before we get started. So we're still in sort of the background phase. But yeah, this is just sort of the prerequisite to developing accessible stuff. One of my favorite practices when it comes to developing an accessible website, and it's something that I make all the developers that I work with do, is I want them to annotate all of their designs before coding, and I don't need the full markup. I just want enough of the markup that I can understand what they expect the semantics to be. And that's important because a lot of times developers don't think about what the markup should be. They just sort of get building and they accept whatever markup the CMS spits out. But no, I actually want people to be deliberate about what the markup should be. You should know what markup you want before you start developing. If you start developing and you focus on the markup last and you just accept whatever the CMS gives you, that's not a good thing. You should know what markup you want before you start developing. Focusing on source order is important. Source order is important for accessibility, primarily because some users with disabilities might prefer to turn your style sheet off, and the only thing you'll see is your unstyled content in the source order that it's presented. So your source order better be right. When you're creating your annotations, you can ignore wrappers, divs, class names, because those aren't really a part of semantics. You can just, those things aren't things that sort of you need when you're planning for accessibility. They're important for front-end development, but they're sort of not very important for accessibility. If you can make an HTML prototype instead of an annotation, that's even better. But for now, we're just going to focus on, I'm just going to encourage you to do an annotation, and that'll get you sort of 80% of the way there. For example, if I'm given this visual design, and I'm given, this is from a news website that just has a list of a lot of news stories, and I want to focus on, this is kind of a representative row of what each news story on the page and the list might be, and I want to annotate what the accessible markup should be. I might start off with an article tag for each of these news stories. Within that article tag, I might put an H2 and a link and an anchor tag within the H2. For the image that's in the row, I would probably keep a null alt attribute, and I wouldn't wrap the image in an A tag because I don't want the image to be a link. I might have the sort of the blurb below the heading to be a P tag. I might want to create a footer element to have sort of who the author is and what the tags are and when it should be published are. So I have a footer. Within the footer, I have an unordered list. Within that list, I put the name of the author, the tag names, and sort of when it was published, and this is the snippet that, as a developer, I would create before I even started developing. And it's getting in the practice of generating code snippets like this as a developer before you actually start developing, that you can be thoughtful about what you want the actual markup to be. And this is just a good practice to be in. You can include like little notes, like if I don't want this image to ever have an alt attribute, I can tell myself null alt attribute, and then I'll remember when I go to start developing. And I'm not necessarily saying this is the right markup for this particular example. You can disagree. You can have a conversation with sort of the other developers and your designers about what the correct markup should be, but it's important to get into a habit of actually creating these annotations before development, so on and so forth. So now that you've sort of decided to create your, you've created your markup, you have your design, you know what you actually want to do, we can talk about configuring some basic Drupal modules. The problem with default field output is if I have a field and I'm rendering it on a content type, I first have a div that wraps the page. I output the label. If I'm showing the label, then I output a wrapper around all of the field items, and then I put a wrapper around each item. This is sort of the out-of-the-box Drupal markup. So for example, if I have a field, I have div class field name. Nested within that, I have my label within its own wrapper, and then I have a wrapping div called field items, and then I have my actual value in my field. It's called field item, and then I close out all of these divs. This is the normal Drupal field markup, and it's stupid. And it's not semantic. It's bad. And we want different markup. So for example, if I have a field that has my favorite foods, I'm from Georgia, so my favorite foods are pulled pork and mac and cheese and sweet tea. My out of the box Drupal markup for that is going to be a wrapper around the whole thing, a wrapper around my label, which is a div, a wrapper around each field item, and then I close this out. The problem with this is that this is not semantic. There are divs everywhere. There are no headings. There are no list items. There are no whatever. We actually want semantics here. So if I go back and I look at this image and I think about what I want the markup to be, I want to have a more sort of semantic alternative. So if I actually want something that's semantic, I probably want my heading to be an H2. And below the H2, I might want an unordered list of what the stuff is. And then I want to close my list. And this is what I want the markup to be. And this is great because it uses a heading and it uses list items. It's semantic. It's better than the really bad Drupal markup. How do we get this? It can be a little bit tricky, and how do we get this is sort of what I really want to show you today. So we need to focus on configuration. We need to enable a module called Display Suite. We need to enable a module called Display Suite Extras. We need to enable the UI for Display Suite, and then we need to do some configuration within the Display Suite module. So I'll walk you through how to do that. I have a Drupal dev site right here. You can see it says Michael's favorite food. If I were to inspect the element, it would show you all of the bad markup, the not semantic markup that we looked at before. So if I go into modules, these are contributed modules, so you'll need to download them into your website, or if you're on YaleSites, these come sort of prepackaged automatically. I'm going to turn Display Suite on. I'm going to turn Display Suite Extras, and Display Suite UI. So I turn those modules on. The next thing that I need to do is I need to go into Structure, and I need to configure Display Suite. I need to go into Display Suite Extras, and I need to click on Enable Field Templates. What Field Templates lets me do is it lets me customize all of that non-semantic markup, and it lets me have it be sort of whatever I want it to be. So I save this configuration. And then I go into manage display for my node. This is still, if you've managed display of your node in the history, sort of controlled what fields you want and what order you want those fields to be, this should be very similar. The only difference is that here, when I click this gear, I'm given an option of what field template do I want to render the output of this field. The default has all of those sort of bad little divs and no semantics or whatever. What I want to do is I want to change that to expert. And what expert does is it gives me a lot of power over how to customize each part of that. Whoops. So I'm going to click my gear again. If I look at my label, I don't want my label to be a div. I want my label to be an H2. So if I click the label checkbox, it gives me a wizard for me to sort of input some to input some HTML right here. So if I want my label to be an H2, I just click the label wrapper and I type H2. It's as easy as that. If I want my field items, remember I want my field items to be in a list, so I'm going to wrap all of my field items in a UL, and that gives me a list. I want each value in my field to be a list item, so in my element I put li for list item. I hit update, I hit save, and what do you know, I now have an H2 and I have an unordered list. So if we go back and we inspect this HTML here, I know this is small, I'll make it bigger. So I have H2, favorite foods, unordered list, 3 list items. Now my markup is semantic. Now people with disabilities can actually make sense of what's on my page. And this is great because divs aren't helpful. Yeah?
Why don't they just do this for all the Drupal sites out of the box?
Because they don't know what semantics you need for each field. It's a good question, but they don't know. It's plausible that I don't want this to be a list. It's plausible that I want these to be p tags. It's plausible that I want to wrap. It's possible that I might be nesting all of these fields in a hierarchy, so maybe I don't want my label to be an H2. Maybe I want my label to be an H4. Maybe it's possible that I'm using a different field formatter that gives me sort of different semantic markup, altogether. But we need a bad default because the use cases could be endless. It's a good question, though. Sort of one problem with this approach, and you can see this if you need to do some styling, is I don't have any classes anymore. So these used to have class field items, class field item, but these are just, vanilla list items, a vanilla list and a vanilla H2. I could go back and I could click manage display. Let's say I want to add a class name. So I can add, there's a field in my wizard to add class names. So maybe I want to add a class of list item to each item in my list. So I just type in list item in this wizard, I hit update, I hit save, and now I have li class equals list item, in my list, which is just great. So cool. So that's how I add some semantics and I can add some custom class names to my stuff. This is also helpful just for front-end development generally if I want the class names I want rather than the class names that Drupal gives me. Maybe I have 2 different fields that I want to have the same markup because I want to style them the same. If they have different class names, then I have to write a whole another rule in my CSS. But if I can just give them both the same class name and I can give them a class name that's not some of the garbage that Drupal spits out, it can just be a little bit more semantic. But so that's great. I've taken my markup and I've made it semantic. I've given it the class names that I want, which is what I care about as a developer. My site owner doesn't care about it. My end user doesn't care about it unless they have, unless they have a disability. But I care about it because I'm a good developer. Let's see how much time we have. Oh, good. So that's one example. We can think about another example. If we have a field group, there's sometimes that for accessibility, I might want to take two fields and wrap them in a wrapper to group them together to improve my semantics. The most common example of this is with a that's not right. That should say figure, not field group. But if I have an image field and I have a field that I want to give a caption to the image field, I might want to wrap both of those in a figure. So, for example, here's a picture that my girlfriend took of me, when the two of us were on vacation in Paris. I am really out of focus, but Versailles in the background is in focus. So we have this image and we have a caption, Michael's girlfriend thinks Versailles is more interesting than he is. Probably true. But here's my markup. My markup is a wrapper for the field, or a wrapper for the field items, the image itself, some closing wrappers, a wrapper around the text, another wrapper around the text itself in a div. So I just have all of these divs that are there. And again, this is not semantic, because we want these associated in a more meaningful way. So the proper semantics for this would be to use a figure element. Within the figure, we could just put our image. Within the figure element, we probably want to put the description of me not being very interesting instead of a fig caption, and we want to close our figure. This is semantic. This is more intelligible for individuals with disabilities. This is just good practice. In order to do this, we need to do all of the display suite stuff we did before, and we also need to turn on a module called field groups. So if I go back to my website, I find the module called field group. I turn it on. I save my configuration. I have this node ready. So I just go to the manage display for this. I'm given the option, I can just add a field group in the manage display. You can give the group, you have to give it a machine name, but the machine name can be anything you want, so I'll just call it my group. You have some options for what you want when you select the format. I choose HTML element because that will give me the option to define whatever HTML element I want. If I save it, and I go back to manage display, what I can do is I can pull all of these other fields that I want to go within this field group sort of inside it. I can nest them. If I click my gear, I might want to change the element to figure. I don't want to show the label. I don't have to worry about any of this stuff. I can give it classes if I want. So I hit update. I hit save, and then if I inspect my element, I can see, I want to make sure that you guys can see, there's now a figure wrapping both of this stuff. Just to complete the exercise, we probably want our two actual fields to be more semantic. One thing you didn't see me do in the previous content type that you're going to see me do here is you have to change the layout in order to use all of Display Suite's cool stuff. So if I change the layout to reset, which is just sort of the default, then these gears, I probably have to drag my field group back up. Yeah, I got to grab my field group back up. That's okay. I drag my field group back up. And I get a dumb error. Don't worry about it. I change my template to expert. I probably leave everything blank because you figure out after a while when you do images, you just leave everything blank and that's fine. I go into my image caption. I want to use expert mode. And I don't want all of those wrappers. I just want the element itself. Instead of a div, I want it to be a fig caption. And so it's a fig caption. That's great. I hit save. I close. And now when I inspect my HTML once again, I look at my stuff, my markup, and there's a figure, and within that figure is an image and a fig caption. And I close my figure and I close my div, and that's how I get semantic HTML, sort of configuring my fields. And that's really good because we should strive to have semantic HTML. That's basically it. So in conclusion, I want you to remember that the foundation of accessibility is semantic markup. There are lots of topics within accessibility, most of which I couldn't demo in like 40 minutes. It just takes more time. You should use display suite extras and custom field templates in order to change the markup of any particular field to get at whatever you want. You can also, I use display sweep for nodes, but you can use display sweep for field collections. You can use display sweeps for paragraph, for users, for taxonomy terms. Any entity can take advantage of display suite. You can use field groups to associate fields and add custom wrappers, because sometimes you do want to add custom wrappers. You can add custom wrappers around multiple fields. And if you want to go further into accessibility, sort of with Drupal, you can think about you can learn more on your own about view modes, which allows you to define different presentations of different entities depending on how you're displaying them. You can think about views has a lot of really great built-in semantic editing tools within it. You can look into theme functions and field formatters and preprocess functions and TPL files if you really are comfortable getting into the back end and creating code. Questions? Yeah.
I have 3.
Great.
So just to verify, so the 3 modules are display suite module, display suite extras, and display suite UI.
Yeah, and so when you download display suite, all of those will come prepackaged. So
Those already in, you said those are already in Yale.
they're already in YaleSites. Yeah.
And if I go in and then I make a node or a content
Mm-hmm.
semantic,
Yep.
is it dynamic? In other words, it will change on the fly. I don't have to do anything else once
Yeah. So as soon as you define the display, every node that you create, so that you're setting the property for the content type. So any node that you create in that content type will have that same configuration.
right?
I'm sorry.
Retro.
Yes. Retro. Yeah. Good question.
And the last one is, what suggestion do you have for workflow or strategy to go and do this for a site that you're maintaining?
For a site that you're maintaining, so that's a good question. Because you're going to be sort of monkeying with your HTML, your selectors could break and your CSS could break. So whatever you want to do, you want to do it in a development environment. And really, once you get in a development environment, you can go nuts. You can kind of experiment with sort of whatever you want. I'm a really big fan of the exercise I sort of showed you. Figure out what you want your dream markup to be in your head, and sort of write that out, and then figure out how to make sort of display suite meet your dream markup. Because I think that'll be the accessibility thinking is kind of like a higher order decision, and you don't want the limitations of the platform to be driving your sort of what your sort of higher order decisions are. So I mean, in a development environment, figure out your ideal markup, and then sort of make whatever changes you can in your development environment, depending on how big the changes you might you want to make. You might actually need to write some custom code, but hopefully there's enough out there that you can find whatever combination of modules and whatever combination of field formatters that you need should be able to get you the right stuff. And a lot of it is just if you're on actually, so YaleSites has a lot of field formatters built in, so you can just try all of those and process of trial and error if you need a field formatter. Many of them are bad, but some of them are good. Trial and error, and then once you have the markup that's correct, if your styling is broken, then you have to fix your styling, and then once you're done fixing your styling at the end, you push it live, and you hopefully explain to your boss why it took you 20 hours to do this for something that almost no one will notice. Does that answer your question? Okay, cool. Yeah.
I know of a tool called Site Improve that you can use to monitor your website
Mm-hmm.
and things like that. And I also heard that it's good for also to look to see whether
Hmm.
I don't use it personally, but we are looking into options like that. You know of any other options?
So that's a good question. I think that I have a couple of thoughts about that. I'm not familiar with Site Improve itself, but I'm familiar with the similar kinds of tools that do that. The best automated tool that I use is there's a Chrome extension called Wave. And that will find a lot of things that's output sort of on the entire page itself. So not just field level things, but also template level things and things like that. That's the best automated checker I use. The rest of it, you just kind of have to look at the code yourself, sort of manually inspect things. Wave does have a heading outliner function, so you can see sort of all of your headings in a nice nested list to see whether you're using a proper heading hierarchy. And that's a really easy way to fix sort of heading semantics errors. I'm jumping from an H2 to an H4 here. Maybe I shouldn't do that. Maybe I should change that H4 to an H3. Or, oh no, every heading on my page is an H3. Maybe I should fix that. A lot of news websites have properly nested headings problems. If you go back and you run the Wave toolbar actually on like a Washington Post or something like that, you can see that they only use H3s, which is, I don't understand the obsession with that one, but whatever. So I like Wave. I'm not familiar with Site Improve, but the problem with Wave is that it's on a per page basis, so you can't just point it at an entire URL. And the other thing is you just have to make some of these, decisions manually, because sort of an automated checker can't catch judgment calls. So what should the proper heading level be is a judgment call that a human can make. A machine can tell you if they're not hierarchical, but if you have two H2s that are adjacent to one another, an automated checker isn't going to flag that as an error, even if that second H2 should actually be an H3. So it's not a substitute for human checking as well. Cool. All right. Go forth and be semantic. All right.